Lakota chief's mother dying of winter fever. A scarred outcast healed her and gained a people. The fire had been out 3 hours before I noticed. That's how far gone I was. I'd built it against a cut bank on the north fork of the Powder, where the clay overhang cut the wind to almost nothing, and I'd gathered enough deadfall for 2 nights if I was careful. I remember adding the last stick sometime around dark, telling myself I'd get more in an hour. Then I was looking at gray ash and my own breath fogging above me, and the cold had come up through the ground and settled into my hip like a spike. I didn't move for a while. I just looked at the ash. That's where I was that winter. That's the kind of man I was. My name is Gideon Cull. I'll tell you that up front because it matters what a man's name carries, and mine had been carrying the wrong things for 6 years. I was 39 years old that November, and I had been moving roughly northward for 2 of those years without much reason except that north was the direction I hadn't tried yet. Before that I'd been west, and before that I'd been east, and before that, well, before that is where the scar starts, so I'll get to it. What I'll tell you first is the cold. The Powder River country in a bad November is a different animal than cold you've met elsewhere. I've been cold in the Ozarks, cold in Kansas in a blue norther, cold in a Missouri jail one February when the walls ran with frost. But the high plains cold is patient. It doesn't bluster. It just arrives, and then it stays. And after a while you start to understand it's not weather so much as a condition of the earth. Like the earth itself has decided to be done with you, and it's in no particular hurry. I lay there against that cut bank looking at my dead fire, and I thought, you could just not build it again. I'm not saying that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm saying it because it's true and because you need to know where I was standing, or lying, I suppose, when everything that came after happened. A man who's got reasons to keep living makes different choices than a man who doesn't. And I had come, somewhere on that long northward drift, to a place where I couldn't name a single reason with any conviction. I had the scar, and I had a horse that was down to its last season, and I had a canvas sack with a skinning knife, a tin cup, 30 feet of cord, and about 1.5 pounds of dried venison that had gone a little green at one edge. That was the whole inventory. I got up and built the fire. Not because I'd decided anything, just because the cold made the decision for me, the way cold does. My hands were bad enough that I struck 4 matches before I got a flame, and I crouched over it like a man crouching over the last thing he owns, which I suppose I was. It was while I was getting the fire going that I heard the horse. Not my horse was back in the trees behind me, tied to a juniper, and she'd gone quiet the way horses go quiet when they smell something they don't understand. This was a different horse, coming from the east along the river, unshod, moving at a trot, then slowing, then stopping somewhere in the dark outside my firelight. I didn't reach for the knife. I didn't stand. I just kept feeding the fire and waited, because a man who comes at you in the dark at a walk on an unshod horse is not a man in a hurry to do you harm. He came into the light on foot, leading the horse. Young, maybe 17, and dressed for the cold in a way I was not, buffalo robe and leggings, and his hair in 2 braids that had come loose from riding. He looked at me and I looked at him, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he said something in Lakota, and when I shook my head he said, in English that was careful and a little formal, like English he'd been taught by someone who read it from a book, "You are a medicine man." I almost laughed, almost. "No," I said. He looked at the fire, at the canvas sack, at my face, at the scar, which he didn't look away from the way most men did. He said, "There is a woman who is sick. My grandmother says you are the one." I said, "Your grandmother doesn't know me." "She knows," he said. He wasn't asking. That was the thing I noticed. He wasn't asking, and he wasn't threatening, and he wasn't pleading. He was simply telling me a fact. There is a sick woman, your grandmother says this man, and so here I am. I've been around the world enough to know that kind of certainty is rare, and that when you meet it in a 17-year-old boy's face you pay attention. How far? I said. 2 hours north, he said. Maybe 3 tonight. I looked at my fire. I looked at the boy. I said, I'm not a medicine man. I'm telling you that plain. I know, he said. Come anyway. I don't know why I went. I could tell you I went because I was curious, or because I had nowhere else to be, and both of those things would be true. But I think the real thing, the thing I didn't put words to until much later, was that someone had come looking for me. For me specifically, or so the boy said. And it had been a very long time since anyone had come looking for Gideon Cull for any reason at all, let alone a good one. I smothered the fire and went to get my horse. His name was Chayton. He told me that on the ride north, in the way young men volunteer things when they're nervous and trying not to show it, a piece of information here, a piece there, nothing connected. His grandmother's name was Winona. She had been sick for 8 days. His father, the chief, whose name he didn't say, the way he didn't say a lot of things, had sent for a white doctor from the fort 3 days ago. But the doctor had not come, and was not going to come because it was 3 days ago, and there was a blizzard working up from the south, and no white man at the fort was going to ride into that for a Lakota woman. He said that last part without bitterness. Just a fact. I asked what was wrong with her. He described it the best he could: fever, shaking. Her breathing had a sound in it, a wet dragging sound. She was keeping nothing down. She'd been lucid 2 days ago, and now she wasn't always. I listened and said nothing, and thought about what I knew and what I didn't know. Here is what I knew. I was not a doctor. I was not a medicine man. What I was, what I had been before, was an apothecary's assistant in a town in Ohio for 4 years. And then for 2 years after that a field orderly in a cavalry unit that saw enough action to teach a man the difference between a wound that would kill and one that wouldn't, and the half-dozen things that could sometimes push a sick man from one side of that line to the other. Willow bark, poultices, the right way to get water into a person who won't drink, how to hold a fever down through the first night until the body decides which way it's going to go. Not medicine. Just enough knowledge to be dangerous, as my captain used to say. The scar, since I said I'd get to it. When I was 33 years old, I was working as an apothecary's assistant in a town in eastern Wyoming, a railroad town, the kind of town that springs up around the tracks and has 4 saloons and a telegraph office and not much else. The man who owned the apothecary was named Marsh, and he was a careful man who kept good records and paid me fairly, and had a daughter named Claire who was 17 when I came to work there, and 20 when things went wrong. I won't tell the whole story because it's not the story I'm telling tonight. What I'll tell you is the short version. Claire and I had an understanding, or I thought we did. Her father thought otherwise. Her father had a different plan for Claire, involving a man named Tolliver who had land and a ranch and 40 years on Claire, and no particular interest in her beyond what she represented, which was the consolidation of adjacent property. I said things I shouldn't have said in a public place to Tolliver's face. Tolliver had 2 brothers. The 3 of them found me on the road outside town one evening and worked on me with a hammer handle for a while, and then left me where I lay. My left cheekbone was broken in 2 places, and they cut me across the face with something, a knife or a piece of metal. I was never sure, and the cut healed badly because I was lying in a ditch for 2 days before anyone found me. By the time it healed, I looked like what I looked like, a man who had been badly used, and showed it in the architecture of his face forever after. Claire's father ran me out of town when I could walk. Claire married Tolliver 2 months later, and I assume is still in that house on that consolidated land, or is dead. I don't know. I stopped trying to know things about that town a long time ago. The scar is not what you'd expect, maybe. It's not dramatic in a wolf-in-the-night way. It's more like a crumple. The left side of my face is lower than the right, and the ridge of old scar tissue pulls at my eye a little, and the whole left side doesn't move quite right when I talk or smile, so I mostly don't smile. Men who don't know me look at me like I'm something that came out of a hole in the ground. Men who do know me mostly look away from it after a while, which is its own kind of thing. Children are different. Children just stare straight at it with their whole faces and sometimes cry. I thought about all of that on the ride north, and then I stopped thinking about it and watched the dark. The camp was in a bend of the river where a stand of cottonwoods broke the wind from the northwest. 7 lodges, maybe 8. It was hard to count in the dark, and the snow that had started to come down about an hour into the ride. Dogs announced us first, then firelight showed at the lodge doors, then shapes of men came out into the dark holding rifles easy and low. Chayton spoke to them. They looked at me. I'd been looked at by men holding rifles before, so I kept my hands where they were and sat still on my horse and let the looking happen. One of the shapes separated from the rest and came toward me, taller than the others. Maybe 45, though the firelight was tricky. He wore his hair loose and he had a blanket over one shoulder, and he looked up at me from beside my horse and took a long time doing it. I could see him deciding things. He said in English, "My mother is sick." "I know," I said. "Your boy came to get me." "You are not a doctor." "No." He looked at my face. I let him. Then he said, "She told Chayton to find the scarred man at the river. She said he would know what to do." He paused. She said this before she stopped making sense. I didn't know what to do with that, so I said, "I can look at her. I can't promise anything." "No one can promise anything," he said, which was the truest thing anyone had said to me in months. His name, I learned later, was Lakota. He was the chief of this band, and he had been a man of some standing among his people for 20 years, and his mother had been behind him in everything for all of those 20 years. The way certain women stand behind certain men, not holding them up but standing even, the way 2 legs are each the other one's balance. I understood that without being told. I understood it from the way he walked ahead of me to the lodge, and the careful nothing in his face. That was the face of a man very close to losing his composure. The lodge was warm and full of smoke, and the smell hit me before I was through the door. Wood smoke, sweat, something herbal that one of the women had been burning, and underneath all of that the particular sweetrot smell of a high fever. I've smelled that enough times to know it the moment it reaches me, and to know what it means. It means the body working very hard against something that is working equally hard in the other direction. She was on a pallet of robes near the fire. 2 women sat on either side of her, one older, one young. They looked at me the way Lakota had looked at me, deciding. I crouched down beside her. Winona. Even sick, even with the fever on her and her face sheened with sweat and her breathing doing the thing Chayton had described, that wet dragging pull, even then she was something. Small. Her hair was gray-white and had come loose from its braiding and spread around her head on the robe. Her hands, which lay at her sides above the blanket, were the hands of a woman who had worked hard all her life, knotted at the knuckles, calloused, strong. Her face in repose with the fever on it was still arranged, like a face that had learned long ago how to hold itself. She was breathing fast and shallow, and the sound was in every breath, that wet rasp. Her skin was dry. I put the back of my hand against her forehead, and she was hot enough that I pulled back a little, which told me what I needed to know about how long this had been building. I looked at the 2 women flanking her. The older one met my eyes. I said, "How long since she drank anything?" The older woman looked at Lakota, who was behind me. He spoke in Lakota. The woman answered. "Since yesterday morning," Lakota said. I nodded. I opened the canvas sack and sorted through what was in it. Not much. The skinning knife, the cord, the tin cup, the dried venison I wasn't going to use. There was one more thing, which I'd wrapped in a piece of oilcloth at the bottom of the sack. A small paper packet of powdered willow bark that I'd been carrying for 8 months, because it had been given to me by a Pawnee woman near the Platte who said to keep it. I'd thought at the time she was just getting rid of me. Now I thought about her face when she pressed it into my hand, and the look she'd had, which was the look of someone who knows something they can't say plainly. I held up the packet and asked Lakota to ask the older woman if they had more willow bark, or the fresh inner bark from the trees. He asked. The older woman, her name was Maka, I would learn, stood up without a word and went out of the lodge. She came back 10 minutes later with a bundle of stripped inner bark from the cottonwoods along the river, damp from the snow. I had her set a pot of water on the fire, and we stripped the bark into it together, her watching my hands and me watching hers, neither of us saying anything. That is one of the things I'll tell you about that night. How much of it happened in silence, or near silence, between two people who had no common language but a shared purpose, which turns out to be enough. While the bark tea was heating, I checked her breathing more carefully, hands on her back, listening for the places where air wasn't moving clean. One side was worse than the other, which could mean a number of things, and I wasn't going to guess at most of them, so I focused on what I could do. I asked for more blankets and asked them to help me sit her up against something, which Maka understood without translation. She was already moving, repositioning the robes, getting Winona's back off the ground. Winona stirred when we moved her. She said something. Lakota from the door of the lodge went very still. I looked at him. He said quietly, She said it's the right face. I didn't say anything to that. I went back to what I was doing. Here's the truth about a night like that. It is not heroic. There is no moment where you do the one great thing and the person turns a corner. What there is a long series of small necessary things, done right, in the right order, without stopping. Get water into her, the bark tea, cooled enough, a little at a time, patient past the point where patience feels possible. Keep her sitting up enough that the bad lung doesn't fill. Watch the breathing. Watch the fever. If the fever spikes, cool cloths, not ice cold, not warm, just cool, on the neck and the wrists where the blood runs close to the surface. Talk to her, even if she can't hear you, because the voice is something the body tracks even when the mind is gone. Keep the fire banked down, not hot, just present. Heat a fevered person and you cook them. What you want is steady. Maka figured out what I was doing within the first hour. After that, she was a half step behind me every time, handing me what I was about to reach for. At one point, she took the damp cloth from my hand when I'd been holding it against Winona's wrist for too long and I was getting drowsy, and she pressed my shoulder once with the flat of her palm, not hard, just a pressure, and took over for a while, which let me sit back against the lodge pole and close my eyes for 20 minutes. Lakota stayed. He sat near the door and he didn't speak and he didn't sleep, and every time I looked up his eyes were open. Chayton came in around midnight and sat beside his father, and they stayed that way, the two of them, not touching, not speaking, just there. I thought about that, about what it was to sit beside your father when your grandmother was dying and hold yourself that still. Around 3 in the morning, the fever broke. It doesn't always happen that way, clean, sudden, obvious. But this time it did. 1 hour she was at the peak of it, and then the sweat came and soaked the robe, and I said to get more robes and get them fast, and Maka was already moving, and we changed her out of the wet ones and kept her warm, and the breathing shifted, still the rasp, still the bad side, but slower, less desperate, like a man who's been running for his life who finally gets to stop and just walk. I sat back on my heels. Lakota was on his feet. He looked at his mother and then he looked at me, and his face, it wasn't relief exactly. It was something that lived underneath relief, something older. He said in Lakota, something that Chayton translated later as, "She lives." I said, "Not done yet. She needs 3 more days at least, maybe 4, that lung's got to clear." He nodded once. He looked at me a long time and then he went outside. I stayed with Winona. I stayed 4 days. Not because I was asked to stay, exactly, more because leaving wasn't raised and I didn't raise it and the work wasn't done. Every morning I made the bark tea. Every morning I checked the breathing, it was improving, the dragging rasp getting lighter each day, the bad side loosening. On the 3rd day she was fully lucid. On the fourth day she sat up and drank on her own and ate a small amount of the stew Maka brought her. That morning, the fourth morning, she looked at me for the first time with her eyes fully open and present. She was looking at the scar. I waited for her to look away. She didn't. She kept looking direct and unhurried, the way you look at a thing you're trying to understand, not a thing that repels you. I've been looked at in a lot of ways. I know the difference. After a while she said something. Chaitin was in the lodge that morning. He was in the lodge a lot of mornings, I realized, which had less to do with his grandmother and more to do with keeping an eye on me, which I didn't blame him for. He translated. She says the mark is old. Yes, I said. She said something else. Chaitin took a moment. He said, she says a mark like that is not made by an enemy. It is made by your own people. I looked at the fire. Yes, I said again. She spoke again, longer this time. Chaitin listened. Then he said, she says that a man marked by his own people and still moving forward, this is not a small thing. She says she knows what it costs. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. She reached out her hand, the strong knotted hand, the hand that had worked hard all her life, and she held it there in the air between us, palm up. Not grabbing, not demanding, just an offering, open. I put my hand in hers. Her grip was still weak from the sickness, but present. She held my hand and looked at my face and said something that Chaitin translated very simply. You did not leave. No, I said. Why? I thought about that. The work wasn't done, I said finally. She looked at me for a long time after that. Then she said something, and Chaitin didn't translate it immediately, and I saw something move across his face that I couldn't read. He was quiet long enough that I said, what did she say? She said, that is the answer she wanted. On the fourth night, Lakota came to sit with me outside. The snow had stopped the second day, and the cold had eased to something that was merely cold rather than lethal, and there was a half-moon on the snow that made everything silver and edgeless. We sat on a log someone had dragged near one of the smaller fires and didn't talk for a while. Then he said, where will you go? I said, don't know. He nodded, he looked at the fire, then, what were you before? I said, apothecary's assistant, then a cavalry orderly, then I don't know. Moving. For how long? 6 years. He was quiet, then, my mother will tell me something tonight or tomorrow, something about you. I will listen to what she says. He paused. She has not been wrong about a man yet. I said, she might be wrong about me. Maybe, he said. He didn't seem troubled by the possibility. What happened to your face? So I told him. I told him the short version, and then I told him a little more of it, and then, and I don't know why, because I had not told the whole of it to anyone in 6 years. I told him all of it, including the part I don't tell, which is Claire's face the last time I saw her in the street, 3 weeks after I could walk again, and how she looked past me like I was a post or a stone. Lakota listened to all of it without changing his face or offering anything, and when I was done he said nothing for a while. Then he said, a man does a thing right and is destroyed for it. This is not a small wound. No, I said. But you are still here. I'm still here. He looked at me, he said, I don't know what you are yet, but I know what you did. We sat there on that log in the moonlit cold for another half hour, not talking, and it was one of the least uncomfortable silences I'd had in a very long time. Winona called for me the next morning. The lodge was warm. Maka had done her hair back in its proper braids, and she was sitting up straight on her pallet. The color had come back into her face, and her eyes were entirely there, entirely present. She looked like a woman who had been sick and had decided not to stay that way. She spoke for a while. Chaitin translated, stopping and starting where she stopped and started. What she said was this. She had been a girl during a hard winter, and her father's band had been low on everything, food, horses, faith, and a white man had come to camp, sick himself, half dead from cold, and her father had debated whether to leave him or bring him in. Her mother had said bring him in. The white man had been a trapper, and once he was well, he had taught her father 3 things about setting beaver traps that changed how their winters went. He had stayed until spring and then left. Her mother had said, "You will know the right stranger by his face, not by how it looks. By how it moves when he thinks no one is watching." She told Chayton to ask me, what was I watching that night when I sat up with her and she was gone in the fever? I thought about it. I said, her breathing. She smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile, and it changed her face entirely, not gentler exactly, but fuller. She said something. Chayton said, "She says a man who watches the breath in a dark hour is a man who knows what matters." Then she said something else longer, and Chayton took longer with it, and when he finished his translation his voice was a little careful. She says, "You have been without a people for a long time." She says this is the true wound, not your face. She says a man needs a people the way the lungs need air, and you have been breathing shallow for 6 years. A pause. She says she would speak to my father about this if you are willing. I looked at her. She was watching me with those direct, unhurried eyes. I said, "I don't know what that means." She spoke again. Chayton said, "She says it means you would be known here. It means when someone asks where you belong, there is an answer." I sat with that. The fire in the lodge was low and orange, and I could hear the camp beginning its morning outside. The dogs, a horse, a child's voice somewhere. And the light through the smoke hole above was the flat white of a winter morning. And Winona was looking at me the way she'd looked at me when she held my hand, direct and without judgment or pity. Just open. Just a question she'd already answered on her side, waiting for me to answer it on mine. I said yes. Here's what happened after that, as straight as I can tell it. Lakota came in that afternoon and spoke with his mother for a long time. I wasn't in the lodge. I was outside helping Chayton with a fence repair on the horse pen, because there was a fence that needed fixing, and it felt better to be doing something with my hands. Chayton worked and I worked, and we didn't say much. He was a good worker, quiet and capable in the way of someone who learned early that the work is its own conversation. When we were done, Lakota came out and said, "Stay through the winter." Just that, not an explanation, not a set of terms. Stay through the winter. I said, all right. He nodded and walked away. That night at the fire, one of the older men of the camp, a man named Hoka, who had a face like weathered sandstone and never once looked directly at my scar, sat next to me and offered me a pipe, and when I smoked it and passed it back, he spoke in Lakota and one of the younger men translated. He says you have good hands. I said thank you. Hoka said something else. The younger man said, he says hands like that don't stay idle long. He says he knows a man by his hands. I looked down at my own hands. I thought about what they'd been used for, mixing powders behind a counter in Ohio, tying off wounds in a field camp in a muddy creek bottom, 6 years of nothing much mostly, 4 days of bark tea and damp cloth and watching an old woman breathe. I said, I hope he's right. Hoka made a sound that might have been a laugh and passed the pipe again. The winter was long. I'm not going to tell you it was easy, or that I became someone new, or that the 6 years of drifting fell off me like a coat. That's not how it works. What happened was slower and stranger than that. There was work which helped. The horses needed tending, and the fences needed mending. And when 3 of the young men went out in a hard week in January to hunt and came back with 2 of their horses lame and 1 rider with a bad gash in his thigh from a fall, I stitched the gash and splinted the leg of 1 horse and put down the other. And after that, Lakota gave me a better lodge than the small one I'd been in, closer to the center of camp. There was Maka, who decided early on that I was her particular project. She taught me words in Lakota, not systematically, just as they were needed. The word for fire, the word for snow, the word for hurt, the word for enough. She corrected my pronunciation with frank impatience, and when I got something right, she moved straight to the next thing without acknowledgement, which is exactly how my father's mother had taught me to set a broken bone at the age of 12, and I found it comfortable. There was Chayton, who was 17 and trying to be a man and finding that harder than expected, the way it always is. We talked when we worked. He asked me about the cavalry, what the battles were like, what I'd seen, whether I was afraid. I told him, yes, always afraid, and that the work was the thing that kept the afraid from eating you. He thought about that for a long time. And there was Winona. Once she was well, truly well, the rasp gone, her strength back, moving through the camp with the unhurried purpose she'd probably had her whole life, she took up a habit of stopping near where I was working. Not to talk at first. She'd stand for a minute and watch and then move on. After a while she started stopping longer. She asked me, through Chayton or through the Lakota I was acquiring in pieces, about what I was doing and why, and I answered as plainly as I could, and she listened the way certain people listen, with their whole attention. One morning in late January I was repairing a travois frame. One of the poles had cracked, and I was splinting it with a strip of rawhide soaked in water that would harden when it dried, which is a trick I'd learned from the Pawnee woman, and I looked up from the work and found Winona watching me. She said, in careful English she had, I was realizing and didn't always choose to use, "Does it still hurt?" I thought she meant the scar. I said, "The face, no, hasn't for years." She made a small motion with her hand, dismissing that. She said, "The other hurt." I looked at the travois frame. I said, "Sometimes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband died 12 years ago. For the first year I was angry. For the second year I was empty. In the third year I found work." She said it so plainly, like she was telling me the weather. I said, "What kind of work?" She said, "The work that was in front of me." She moved on. I held the strip of rawhide against the pole and thought about that for a long time. What I'm going to tell you now is the part that's hardest to tell, because it happened slowly and I was inside it and didn't see it happening, which is probably how it has to happen, or you'd argue yourself out of it. By February, the camp knew me. Not all of them liked me. There were 2 men in particular, older, who made their feelings about my presence clear without ever saying them directly, the way men do, with where they put their eyes and how they arranged themselves around a fire, but they knew me. I had a place in the daily work of the camp. When the horses needed doctoring, they came to get me, and when someone was sick, Maka came to get me, and when there was fence work or framework or the kind of problem that needed a man with good hands and patience, Chayton came to get me. That sounds small, but I want you to understand what it was after 6 years, to be the person they came to get, to have a specific use in a specific place with specific people who knew your name. I had not had that. I had been moving through the world like something that had been blown loose, useful sometimes to strangers, and then gone, and no one went looking for me when I went. I started sleeping differently, deeper. Less of the half-awake animal watchfulness that had been my habit, so long I'd forgotten it was a habit. Winona noticed. She had a way of noticing things without making a production of having noticed them. One morning she brought me a cup of something she'd made, a tea, something different from the willow bark, something that tasted like pine and something else I couldn't name, and she sat near me while I drank it and she said, "You are resting now." I said, "Some." She said, "Good." That was it. She got up and went back to her work. But the tea kept appearing in the mornings. Not every morning, but most. And I started watching for it, started noting whether it was there yet when I woke up. And at some point I realized I was doing that, and I thought about what it meant to have something to watch for in the morning. In March, when the first break in the weather came and the snow started its slow retreat from the south-facing slopes, Lakota told me that in the spring the band would move. They moved each year north in spring, following the herds, then south again before the winter. He said this and paused and looked at me. I said, "I'll need to know where you're going." He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, "Yes, you will." He turned and walked away, and I stood in the mud of the thawing camp and realized what I'd said and what he'd said back, and I stood there for a while with that. I was thinking about it that evening, sitting outside my lodge with the last light going out over the western plain, the sky that color it goes in early March, a blue so deep it's almost a sound, when Winona came and sat next to me. She had something in her hands, a piece of worked leather folded. She set it on her knee without showing it to me. She said in English, "I want to tell you something." I said, "All right." "When I was sick," she said, "and the fever was at its worst, I was not always here." She touched her temple. "But sometimes I heard things." She stopped. I waited. She said, "I heard you talk to me." I hadn't known she could hear. I'd thought, the way you think when you're alone with a task in a dark lodge at 3 in the morning, that I was alone with my thoughts. I'd been talking to her the way I talk to horses, I suppose, not words that expected answers. I said, "What did I say?" She said, you said, "Do not go yet. You said there is more morning to see." I didn't remember saying that, but I believed her. She opened the folded leather. Inside was a knife, not the kind of knife you skin with, smaller, a different shape. The handle was bone, carved with something I couldn't quite read in the dimming light. She held it out to me. I took it. The weight of it was good, balanced, someone's careful work over a long time. She said, "This was my husband's. He carried it for 30 years. She paused. "He was a man who did not leave before the morning either." I held the knife and looked at it, and did not say anything because there wasn't anything that fit. She put her hand on my arm, just rested it there on the sleeve of my coat, her knotted strong hand. She looked at the western light, which was nearly gone. She said, "You came to this camp with nothing, and you stayed, and you gave what you had, and you did not ask for anything back." She said it plainly, like a statement of fact. "This is a thing we see." I said it was just the work. "Yes," she said, "that is what I am telling you." She left her hand on my arm, and we sat there, while the light went out entirely, and the first stars came. She wasn't holding me up. She wasn't leaning on me. She was just there, her hand on my arm, and the last of the winter cold coming in from the north, and the camp going quiet around us, and the smell of wood smoke and horse and frozen earth. I sat with my hand around the handle of a dead man's knife that a woman had given me out of her own keeping, and I thought, this is what it feels like to be found. Not saved. I want to say that clearly. I've said this is a twist B story. She saves him, and it is, but not in the way that word usually goes. She didn't pull me out of a burning building. She didn't put herself between me and a bullet. What she did was slower and harder, and in the end more total. She gave me her belief. That's what it was. She told her son I was the one when she was half out of her mind with fever, and either that was true and she was right, or it was the most generous accident in the history of the Powder River country. Her son rode out in the dark and came back with me. I did what I knew how to do, which wasn't much, but was exactly what was needed. She got well. And instead of letting me drift on the way I'd been drifting, she and Lakota and Maka, and even Chayton, in his 17-year-old sideways fashion, pulled me in. Not saved claimed. There is a difference. A man who is saved has been rescued from a thing. A man who is claimed has been given a thing, a context, a set of faces that know his, a place in the ongoing work of people who intend to keep living. One of those men is grateful. The other one is something more. The other one has been given a reason. Winona knew the difference. I think she'd known men of both kinds, and she chose which kind I would be. I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then I'll stop. The spring came slow that year. It always does up there. You think it's done, and then another week of cold, another freeze. But by late April the grass was coming, and Lakota gave the word to break camp and move north. The packing took 2 days. I packed with them. On the morning of the second day, while I was checking the lashings on the travois, Winona came and stood beside me. She was dressed for travel, everything packed down and her horse ready. She looked at the tied-down packs the way you look at a thing you're satisfied with. She said, "Are you ready?" I said, "I think so." She said, "You think so?" I said, "I'm ready." She looked at me. She had her hair in the road braids, tight and practical, and the light was the flat, bright light of an early spring morning, no color in it yet, and her face in that light was entirely clear. Not young, she was past 60, worn by the years the way good wood is worn, tighter, denser, more itself. She looked at my scar the way she'd looked at it since the beginning, without flinching and without performance. She said, "My son will tell you what we call you now, if you want to know." I said, "What do you call me?" She said a word in Lakota. I didn't know it. She said, "The man who stayed." She walked away to her horse. I stood there by the travois in the morning light. The camp was moving all around me, horses and dogs and children, and the ordered noise of people who know how to pack a life and carry it. And I was in the middle of it, and I was part of it, or part enough, or becoming part enough, which is probably the best any man can say. I touched the knife on my belt, the one with the bone handle. I thought, there is more morning to see. And I went to my horse.